So after the release of Ace Combat 3, the franchise was actually left in a pretty weird spot. The game sold well and was received very well in Japan, but internationally it reviewed pretty poorly across the board, with reviewers and fans alike being disappointed in the game's lack of mission variety and proper storyline. So when the team at Namco got to work on the sequel, they set out to make a game that would be enjoyed both by domestic and international audiences alike. So how does Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies improve upon previous entries, and how does it hold up today? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the fourth in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you'll be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check that out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies is a combat flight simulation game developed and published by Namco for the PlayStation 2 in 2001. And along with being the first game in the franchise released on the PS2, it's also the first game in what many of you in the comments and live stream chats have been telling me is called the Golden Trilogy of Ace Combat. So my expectations are pretty high going into this one. AC4 takes place in the year 2004 in the fictional universe of Strange Reel. Strange Reel is actually the same universe that all the games have taken place in so far, but this is the first time that it was specifically named in-game, and there's a fairly interesting reason behind that. The concept of Strange Reel wasn't actually thought of until this game's development, and the only reason it came around in the first place is because Ace Combat 4 was supposed to be a reboot of the franchise after the lukewarm reception of the third game. The game even originally was being referred to internally as Ace Combat 1. It was ultimately decided that this wouldn't serve as a full series reboot, but would rather just be placed earlier on the timeline relative to AC3, which according to all the sources that I could find is still considered canon to this day, even though Ace Combat 4 was originally supposed to wipe that game's existence from the timeline. Anyway, we play as Mobius 1, an ace pilot for the Independent State Allied Forces, or ISAF for short, fighting in a war to retake an occupied nation from invading forces. And the first thing I noticed when loading up the game for the first time was just how much I disliked this game's UI. Half of these menus are perfectly fine, while the other half are jumbled messes. In case you haven't noticed already, I use emulators to record older console games for these reviews in order to scale them up to 4K and get 60 frames per second out of them, stuff like that. And at first, I genuinely thought that the menus looked like this due to an emulator bug. Like, whose idea was it to have all these overlapping lines all over the place? The UI in some places was so distractingly bad that it was genuinely hard to get the information that I was supposed to from my briefings or from the statistics in the hangar, stuff like that. The one thing I will give these menus is that the aircraft statistics are much more detailed than in Ace Combat 3, but thanks to the hangar having a very bright interior and the statistics being displayed with white text, sometimes you can't even properly read the stats depending on where the camera is, and you'll just have to wait for it to pan around to a darker area of the hangar to be able to read things clearly. Additionally, the briefings are much less detailed than those that we saw in the first two games, though they are still much better than whatever this was that we got in the third. Like I've said in every single video so far, I really loved the unique and highly detailed approach to the mission briefings that those first two games took, and I'm going to be incredibly disappointed if they continue to be absent from these games going forward. So as far as the briefings go, I still don't think they're as good as the early titles, but they are at least an improvement over the previous entry, so I suppose they earn a bit of credit for that. And so far, we've been off to a pretty rough start in the presentation department, but oh man, does that immediately stop once we actually get into the gameplay. In case you didn't quite catch it earlier, this game came out in September of 2001. That's 1 month before Grand Theft Auto 3 and 2 months before Halo Combat Evolved. And I could sit here and go into a lot of detail, but if you just put those three in a line, one of these comes out as a pretty clear winner. The visuals here are absolutely stunning for their time. Sure, the terrain textures are still pretty low quality when you get close to them, and if you get a good look at Mobius 1 with this increased native resolution I recorded in, yeah. But the aircraft, the missiles, the overall picture of the game from a distance, it's all just beautiful for when the game came out, and it's an incredibly impressive feat of graphical optimization in the early 2000s. Every single one of these games since AC2 have looked amazing for their time, but this one, in my opinion, looks the furthest ahead of its time so far. I even asked a close friend of mine to take a look at the game while I was recording it and tell me what year he thought the game was released in, and he answered 2009, which I think really speaks for itself here. Along with this, the first-person HUD has been massively improved from Ace Combat 3. The pitch ladder has been straightened back out, making it a lot easier to read while also paying attention to everything happening beyond it compared to the third game. And that big compass that was constantly on screen is also gone, and while that thing looked cool, it definitely muddied the overall image, and I think that removing it was the best thing they could have done in regards to that element in particular. And something that's completely new, but that I think helps a lot, is that they've brought the speed and altitude readouts from the edges of the screen to the edges of the pitch ladder, which not only makes them much more convenient to read while focusing on your targeting, but also gives this sort of border to the central elements of the HUD themselves, giving them a much cleaner look all around. And on top of all that, they've even added an entirely new view mode with this game called the Cockpit View. This is essentially just the first-person perspective, but made to look like you're actually sitting inside of the cockpit, rather than feeling like the camera was just stuck to the nose of your plane. Like I said, not very meaningfully different from first-person mode, but the immersion factor here should not be ignored, and I think it's a really cool addition for people that want to squeeze that little bit of immersion out of the Ace Combat games. And as a final note for the camera perspectives, third-person mode returns of course, but the thing that I really want to make note of is that they kept the machine gun indicator in the third-person view just like AC3. In my opinion, this was probably the best quality of life improvement from the third game, so seeing it return here and not being thrown out with a lot of other elements from that game is really great. Continuing with the presentation talk though, the sound design in Ace Combat 4 is easily the best in the series so far. All the little beeps and boops from your computer systems, the hiss of missiles getting launched from your plane, and more than anything else, the incredibly satisfying roar of your engines when hitting the afterburner. Everything in AC4 just sounds so much better than in any of the PS1 games, and it's one of those things that I noticed before I even finished my first mission. And before we move on from presentation entirely, we need to talk about the music here. Rather than replicating the rock music of the first two games, or the more subdued electronic music of the third, Ace Combat 4 features a blend of rock, orchestral, and synthesizer music, and even has one track that features a Latin choir. While I think that Ace Combat 2 still has my favorite soundtrack to listen to completely on its own, I think that AC4's music fits the gameplay much better, and offers the most deep and all-around best musical experience of the franchise so far. But getting into the campaign proper, the campaign structure is completely unique to the franchise up to this point. Rather than having the non-linear approach of the first two games, or the third game's linear campaign with branching paths based on decision points, Ace Combat 4 has 18 missions that are played in a completely linear order. For every playthrough of this game, you will play the same missions in the same order. And I think that this is actually a positive change for the franchise. While it might sound a little backwards to some that giving the player less freedom and variety would be a positive change, I feel that having that guarantee that every mission will be played every playthrough led to developers improving the individual mission quality drastically compared to the previous games. And it definitely helps that AC4 has the best controls of all the games so far. They brought back the full 360-degree control of AC2, but they feel so much tighter here. While it's hard for me to put my finger on exactly what it is that I'm feeling here, I noticed that every time I would boot up Ace Combat 2, the stick felt a little overly sensitive, and I would have to adjust every single time I sat down to play to make sure that I don't overturn constantly. But here in 4, it feels so much smoother. And even though the more realistic aircraft physics from the third game have unfortunately been removed, it feels like there's more weight behind the steering than that of the second game. It felt like I had all the freedom of AC2's controls, but with a level of polish that that game never had, making it easily the best feeling game in the series up to this point. Something else that I noticed early on is that the fuel gauge from the first couple games has also been left behind, much like in AC3, but here they've added in a hard timer to every mission. This allows them to ensure that players are moving through missions at a solid pace, but now, instead of just having the player randomly fall out of the sky and crash once the time limit is up, they can actually have an in-universe objective-related reason for every single mission to have that fail state. It's definitely a lot more interesting to have a unique fail condition at the end of the timer for every single mission, not to mention how much more believable and immersive it is, and I definitely feel like this is a really neat evolution of the system. Speaking of evolving existing systems, the mission path replay has also returned, and it looks much better here. Rather than having a top-down map that simply follows your path, it's a full 3D map that tracks and displays the paths of all aircraft in the level, so you actually get a really cool depiction of some of the larger scale dogfights in the game through this. Along with this, you might have already noticed here that earning credits to purchase new aircraft returns in this game after being absent in 3. I'm glad to see that this wasn't just ditched, as I feel like this goes a lot further in making the player feel like they're progressing throughout the campaign compared to how Ace Combat 3 just gives you new planes at certain points. They even make the credits more important than they ever have been before, allowing players to purchase specific weapons to outfit their aircraft with. These tie into a new gameplay mechanic where the player can swap between their standard missiles and their secondary weapon, with these secondary weapons being things like unguided bombs, napalm bombs, long-range missiles, things like that. Every fighter in the game comes with a default secondary weapon that varies from jet to jet, with 1 or 2 additional secondary weapons available for purchase if you would prefer them. And honestly, I really like this addition and might even like to see it taken further in future titles. Maybe allow players to purchase different types of machine guns like the ones we saw in AC3, allow us to replace our standard missiles with different variations. Hell, let us purchase different cosmetic paint jobs for our planes to give us even more reason to replay these games over and over again. I love when games have options like this for the player, and as the system stands currently, it would take more than a single playthrough to purchase every aircraft as well as all the weapons for them, but I think this could be an incredible way to offer some sort of endgame experience to these games, and would love to see it expanded upon in the future. Speaking of weapons, machine guns finally feel like a main part of your kit in this game. In all of the PS1 games, it was possible to use the machine guns, and I'm sure that with a lot of practice, I could get consistent with them in those games, but they never felt like a better option than the missiles. It never had anything to do with the damage, it was always to do with the fact that targeting with them was incredibly difficult. The machine gun indicator was always present, but in the entire PS1 trilogy, it tended to be inaccurate, with your bullets either being slightly ahead of or behind the reticle itself. But here in Ace Combat 4, the targeting reticle is finally an accurate portrayal of where your bullets will hit, and I found myself using machine guns much more throughout my time with this game. I even frequently ran out of machine gun ammo since I was using them almost as much, if not equally as much as my missiles here. And speaking of running out of ammo, let's talk about my favorite change in the entire game. The landings from Ace Combat 2 and 3 have returned, except for now, they serve an actual gameplay purpose rather than just being the cherry on top of a mission here and there. In Ace Combat 4, you can leave the mission area at any time to go back and land at your base to resupply your ammo before taking off again and returning to the mission. Obviously, this takes a decent amount of time to do, meaning it isn't always the best idea thanks to the time limit, but it's a dynamic that I really loved. There were a couple times in my playthrough where I ran out of both missiles and machine gun ammo, and in situations like that, this new mechanic is an absolute lifesaver. Overall, I'm a huge fan of this change and would obviously love to see it return in future games. And since we're getting into mission talk a little bit, I think now would be a great time to talk about the mission variety. While designing Ace Combat 4, the team at Namco didn't reinvent mission variety, but they mixed things up very creatively. For example, there's one mission where you'll have to execute a fairly standard attack on an enemy base, but near the end, a major twist gets thrown at you. The enemy has a super weapon known as Stonehenge, which is essentially a giant railgun that is meant to shoot asteroids out of the atmosphere, but the enemy militia has started using it to turn the tides of battles instead. So after you've destroyed the base, you get warned that Stonehenge is winding up to fire at your location, and you need to fly at an altitude of lower than 2,000 feet in order to escape safely. The real twist here is that because of the elevation of the base, 2,000 feet is below ground level for the majority of the map, except for in the trenches and ravines that are scattered throughout it. So the standard mission suddenly becomes a ravine run where you need to escape a railgun that is trying to shoot you out of the sky. It's a great example of how to use mission types that the devs were already familiar with developing, but combining them in a way that mixes things up for players and catches them off guard, and I think it's a really creative way to get around how insanely difficult it would be to create entirely new mission types for these games after so many entries. On top of that, the majority of the missions in this game are purely time-based. And I'm not repeating from earlier when I talked about the timer, I mean that most missions in this game don't end from you completing a specific objective, they instead end when the timer reaches 0. And this decision is one that I'm somewhat mixed on. On one hand, the missions give you a rank based on how many points you accumulate within the time limit, so if you're going for higher ranks, this actually works out pretty well, but on the other, sometimes you're not overly concerned with what rank you get, and spending 20 minutes flying around in the same battle can get a little dull. For the sake of transparency, I found that I enjoyed this system more often than I didn't, but there were a couple missions that went on a little long for my taste, and if I could have just completed an objective and moved on, I would have. Another amazing part of Ace Combat 4's missions is the scale of them. By the end of your first hour or so, you'll be properly eased into the game's mechanics, and from this point on, every single mission in the game is a large-scale battle. You'll have plenty of fighters to dogfight with, hundreds of ground targets to eliminate, and you'll spend 15 to 20 minutes in each of them, with it being practically impossible for you to clear the entire map, and it just becomes about dealing as much damage in that time as you can. These battles are wildly entertaining to take part in and are a natural evolution from the PS1 trilogy now that the developers actually have hardware capable of rendering this many targets on screen. And these battles tie directly into the story of the game, which is another large part of the game that was approached in a totally new way here. In the game's cutscenes, we follow a story being told to us by an unnamed man telling us the story of his childhood. When this narrator was young, his family's home was destroyed by a fighter jet that was shot out of the sky, and from that point on, the boy was a homeless orphan. Shortly after that day, the boy's country was occupied by the Erusea militia and was held forcefully by them in their war against the ISAF, which, in case you forgot, is the military that our character is a part of. This man tells us his personal story of living through the war, and it's an incredibly sad and touching story to sit through. But as you play through the campaign and you hear more and more of this man's story, you'll notice that the man continuously makes note of events that you will then immediately play through the battles of, and that you are actually playing as the ace pilot of the ISAF military going through the events of the war alongside the man's story. Then, in the very last cutscene, it's revealed that the narration of the entire campaign was this unnamed man writing a letter to our character thanking us for all that we did to free his nation during the war. The cutscenes are our player character reading the letter itself, and the missions are us reliving the battles in our own memory as we're reminded of them. It's not the most complex story I've ever seen by any means, but I found it really touching. Sure, it's nowhere near as deep and elaborate as Ace Combat 3's story, but it's still a hell of a lot more than the first two games in the franchise, and if we got more stories like this, I wouldn't exactly complain, as it's very entertaining despite its simplicity. And there's more that I could go into here, but I'm just keeping short for the sake of brevity. Things like the battles that you'll have with the elite enemy squadron of yellow pilots, the massive super weapons that you'll take out during these missions, as well as the dynamics of some of the man's more personal relationships from when he was a child. Like I said, it's very simple, but something about it kept catching me off guard, and I actually really enjoyed it. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Ace Combat 4. The gameplay essentially feels like Ace Combat 2 with a ton of mechanical polish as well as a generational leap in technology, the story is entertaining, and the player progression is a hell of a lot better than that of the previous entry. And despite the fact that this game was essentially the team returning to the original vision of the franchise after the lukewarm response to Ace Combat 3, meaning that this likely wasn't the direction they wanted to take the franchise in, I think that this game is easily the best of the franchise so far, and beyond that, it's just a damn good video game. It still has some things to improve on, but it's one of those games that you play and it just immediately feels like the series is starting to come into its own, so I'm very much looking forward to seeing where they go from here. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies an 8.9. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. But if you can't afford to, don't worry about it. We've all been there, and your likes, comments, etc. already help out the videos plenty. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you definitely enjoy the rest of my Ace Combat videos, or maybe even another series we recently started doing the exact same thing for the Metal Gear series. So if you're interested, I'll have both of those linked right here on screen.